The morning sunlight filtered softly through the tall windows of the Archer Tower lobby, casting long, golden rays across the sleek marble floors. Nina Blackwood was already running late, and the day seemed intent on making sure things stayed that way. The first sign was her alarm clock, which had failed to go off at the usual time. Then, to make matters worse, her coffee maker had decided it was the perfect day to die. And now, as she dashed through the polished lobby of the building, her portfolio case clutched tightly in her hands, she was 15 minutes late for a meeting that could change everything. Nina barely noticed the people around her as she rushed past, her curly hair bouncing wildly with each hurried step. The weight of the portfolio she carried felt far heavier than the carefully curated art inside it. It was more than just the tattoo designs she had poured her heart into. It was her last shot. She needed this meeting. The tattoo shop she owned, Skin Stories, was hanging by a thread, and only a big investment could save it. She had spent hours putting together the perfect portfolio, the one she hoped would catch the eye of the right client. The kind of high-end client who could turn everything around with a single, well-placed contract. Her heels clicked sharply against the marble as she darted toward the elevator. She reached the doors just as they started to close, and without thinking, she thrust her hand out, halting them just in time. A man stepped forward to hold the door open for her, looking like someone who belonged in the building with his serious expression and heavy toolbox. He didn't look like the usual maintenance guy Nina expected. Instead of a simple uniform, he wore a well-fitted shirt that clung to muscles she couldn't help but notice, dark jeans, and steel-toed boots. His dark hair was neat on the sides, but longer on top, and a shadow of stubble gave his face a rugged, handsome edge. "Thanks," Nina muttered breathlessly, stepping into the elevator and pressing the button for the 42nd floor. She noted that the 35th floor light was already lit. The man, not looking at her, simply nodded. His amber eyes flickered to hers for a moment before turning back to the doors. A silence stretched between them. The hum of the elevator was the only sound as it began its ascent. "Busy day?" he asked suddenly, his voice surprisingly soft, given his strong presence. "You could say that," Nina replied, adjusting her grip on the portfolio, trying not to fidget. She had no idea why she felt compelled to share, but something about this stranger made it easy. Everything that could go wrong did. And now, I'm late for a meeting that could make or break my business. The word slipped out before she could stop herself, and she quickly turned to face the doors, trying to cover the sudden vulnerability that she hadn't meant to show. "What kind of business?" he asked, his voice still calm. Nina felt his gaze move to her arms, where the intricate tattoos peeking out from beneath her sleeve. "I own a tattoo studio," she said, shifting her weight. "Skin Stories. I'm meeting with a potential investor who could help me expand the business." "Cool name," he replied thoughtfully. "Sounds like a big deal." Nina gave a tight smile. "It is. It's everything right now." As the elevator continued its climb, Nina tried to focus on her breathing, on staying calm despite the overwhelming sense of dread gnawing at her. This meeting was important. She couldn't afford to blow it. The elevator lurched suddenly, causing Nina to stumble forward. Her hand shot out instinctively to grab the rail along the wall, but in doing so, her portfolio slipped from her fingers and landed with a heavy thud on the floor. The lights flickered, once, then twice, before cutting out entirely. For a moment, the elevator plunged into complete darkness, a suffocating silence wrapping around them. Nina's heart pounded in her chest as her fingers scrambled for her phone, hoping for a signal. Anything. The man remained unnervingly calm, though. He set his toolbox down carefully and walked over to the control panel. "We're stuck," he said, pressing the emergency button. His voice didn't carry the same edge of panic that Nina's did. No, no, no," she muttered frantically. "This can't be happening. Not today. This meeting. It was my last shot." She fumbled with her phone, but the words, "no signal," stared back at her mockingly. The man glanced at her briefly, then returned his attention to the control panel, his movements calm and deliberate. "There should be a response from security," she said, her tone sharper than she meant. "They should be here by now." The man nodded. "There should be." He pressed the emergency button again, holding it down longer this time. The tension between them was palpable. Nina paced back and forth, her frustration building with each passing second. She could feel the weight of the situation pushing down on her chest, suffocating her. They'll never reschedule. They won't. It's over. It's all over. The man's calm voice cut through her spiraling thoughts. "Take a deep breath. Panicking won't help." Nina shot him a glare, about to snap something back. But the steady look in his eyes made her pause. Maybe it was the way he said it. Maybe it was the way he seemed completely unruffled. She inhaled deeply, holding her breath for a moment before slowly releasing it. "Better?" he asked. "Not really," she admitted. "But thanks." Her watch told her she was already 20 minutes late. Even if the elevator started moving again, it would be a lost cause. The thought of blowing this meeting, this one shot, hit her like a punch to the gut. The man frowned, pulling his phone from his pocket. "No signal," he muttered, checking his own phone before returning to the control panel. His eyes met hers again. "Looks like we're stuck here for a while." Nina shook her head, her mind racing with ways she could salvage this. She couldn't just sit here. "I can't believe this. I might as well just walk out of here now. I won't get another chance. I won't." And as she spoke, Nina didn't realize that this stranger, this mysterious man with the warm amber eyes, would change everything, just not in the way she expected. The elevator encounter. The sleek doors of the Archer Tower elevator slid open with a soft chime, offering Nina a brief glimpse of the polished metal interior. The building, with its gleaming surfaces and modern design, was a testament to power and wealth, a place where success and influence mingled in every corner. Nina hesitated for only a moment before stepping inside, her heels clicking against the smooth floor. She was already late, but there was no time to waste. She had to make it to that meeting, and she had to make it count. As the doors slid shut behind her, she pressed the button for the 42nd floor, where her fate awaited. The elevator's soft hum was the only sound as it began its slow ascent. Nina took a deep breath, trying to calm the swirling anxiety in her chest. Her portfolio case, heavy with expectation, rested in her hands, and she tried not to think about the pressure bearing down on her. This meeting could either save her struggling tattoo studio, skin stories, or drive the final nail into its coffin. But as the elevator began to ascend, Nina's thoughts were interrupted by a low, steady voice. "Busy day?" The man standing beside her spoke suddenly, breaking the tension that had filled the small space. His voice was smooth, surprisingly soft for someone who looked as solid as he did. Nina glanced over at him, momentarily distracted by his presence. He was tall, much taller than her, and built in a way that suggested strength without effort. His dark, neatly trimmed hair contrasted against the softer waves on top, and the stubble on his jawline added to his rugged appeal. Yet it was his eyes that drew Nina in. Amber, like warm honey, sharp and alert in a way that seemed to see straight through her. His gaze shifted to meet hers for a moment, then returned to the elevator doors as if this was a routine ride, though there was nothing routine about him. Nina forced herself to look away, attempting to regain focus on her situation. The last thing she needed was to be distracted by a stranger. "You could say that," she muttered, her fingers tightening around her portfolio case as if to steady herself. She shifted her weight slightly, avoiding the urge to fidget. She didn't want to give off the impression of being nervous, but she felt everything at once: fear, frustration, desperation. The weight of the situation was more than just the loss of the potential contract. It was the reality that she might be failing, and she couldn't afford to fail. The man's lips curled into the slightest of smiles, and he glanced back at her, briefly. "Everything that could go wrong, did?" he asked, his voice light, almost teasing. "Exactly," she responded without thinking, her words spilling out. She caught herself quickly, feeling exposed, like she'd said too much. The man tilted, his head slightly, giving her an inquisitive glance. "I understand that feeling. It's as if the universe decides to make a point." Nina chuckled bitterly at the understatement, shifting again in the confined space. She felt strangely compelled to continue, though, almost as though he was drawing the words out of her with his easy confidence. "First, my alarm didn't go off. Then my coffee maker decided it was the perfect day to die. And now, here I am, late for a meeting that could either save my business or ruin it completely." He nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving the door, in front of them. "Sounds like one of those days where the universe just can't help itself, huh?" His words were calm, but there was an undertone of understanding that made Nina pause. "I suppose so," Nina replied, her mind still racing with thoughts of her meeting, the people she was about to face, and how she might salvage this sinking ship. She hadn't expected to share this much with a complete stranger, but there was something about him, something grounded and unhurried, that made her feel safe for a moment. "What kind of business?" he asked, his amber eyes flicking briefly toward her arms where her tattoos peeked from beneath her sleeves. Nina blinked, suddenly realizing that the stranger had caught sight of her ink. She cleared her throat and straightened her shoulders, trying to maintain the professional demeanor that her job required, even though her nerves were getting the better of her. "I own a tattoo studio. It's called Skin Stories," she said, her voice steady despite the flutter in her chest. "I'm meeting with an investor who could help me expand the business. If this meeting goes well, I might finally get a chance to turn things around." "Cool name," he said, and for the first time he turned his full attention to her. His gaze seemed to linger for a moment, studying her, his eyes intense but not intrusive. "Tattooing is an art, right?" Nina nodded. "Yeah, it's more than just a job for me. It's a passion. But it's been tough," she added, her voice dropping slightly. "Not everyone understands what it takes to keep a business like that afloat." His expression softened, and he gave a slight nod, as if he understood more than he let on. "I get that. Running a business is hard. You put your heart and soul into it, and sometimes it feels like it's not enough." Nina felt a sudden warmth toward this stranger, this man who was nothing like what she expected. She glanced at him again. He didn't look like a maintenance guy at all. His clothes, a tight-fitting Henley shirt and dark jeans, suggested someone far more sophisticated, more refined than the job he appeared to be doing. His rugged, almost ethereal appearance didn't match his surroundings, and Nina found herself intrigued. She stole another glance at him, noting the casual confidence with which he carried himself. The way he stood there, calm and composed, was almost unsettling. It wasn't often that someone seemed so effortlessly at ease in a space as sterile and unforgiving as the elevator. Suddenly, the elevator lurched to a violent stop. Nina gasped, grabbing onto the handrail to steady herself. Her heart skipped a beat as the lights flickered once, then twice, before plunging them into complete darkness. The air in the small, confined space became thick with tension. Nina's breath hitched in her throat as she reached for her phone, hoping to find a signal. Nothing. The silence in the elevator was suffocating, and Nina's pulse quickened as she fumbled with the device. The only light now came from the dim emergency lamps overhead, casting an eerie bluish glow that only heightened the feeling of claustrophobia. The world outside the elevator was a distant memory, and Nina was acutely aware of the man beside her, standing still and calm despite the fact that they were now trapped. He didn't seem to be fazed at all. Instead, he simply put down his toolbox, his amber eyes scanning the control panel with a calmness that seemed almost deliberate. He pressed the emergency call button. Once, then again. His movements were fluid, practiced, like someone used to handling chaos. "We're stuck," he said matter-of-factly, his voice calm but with an undercurrent of something deeper, something serious. Nina's heart raced. She tried to stay composed, but the mounting frustration bubbled to the surface. "Great," she muttered, her voice tight. "Just great." The man didn't seem to take her frustration personally. Instead, he checked his phone, then his watch, and then turned his attention back to her. "This is not how I planned to spend my morning," he said softly. His tone was level, calm, and almost soothing. "I'm already late," Nina replied, quickly, her voice rising in pitch. "This meeting, this could be my only chance. This—" She stopped herself, realizing that she was almost shouting. She closed her eyes, taking a deep breath, trying to calm herself. The man's steady gaze never wavered. Take a deep breath. Panicking won't help. Nina wanted to snap at him, to tell him that she knew that already, but something about his unwavering calm made her hesitate. She breathed in, holding her breath for a moment before slowly releasing it. "Better?" he asked, his voice soft. Nina gave a small nod, though she didn't feel better. Not at all. She glanced at her watch. The time seemed to mock her. 20 minutes late. Even if they got moving now, it would be pointless. She had lost the opportunity. A small smile played at the corner of his lips. "Well, looks like we'll have plenty of time to talk." Nina glanced at him, her stomach twisting with nerves and something else, something she couldn't quite place. The silence between them deepened, broken only by the distant hum of the emergency lights. But for the first time that day, Nina felt not so alone. The tension and growing connection. Nina stood in the elevator, her back pressed against the cold metal wall, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Her mind was racing, and her heart was thumping loudly in her ears as she tried to process the situation. The elevator was still stuck, and she was late, really late, for the meeting that could either save or ruin her tattoo business. The panic was threatening to overwhelm her, but there was something about the man standing beside her that made it different. She wasn't sure what it was yet, but she couldn't deny the odd pull she felt towards him. It wasn't just the way he moved, calmly and with purpose. It wasn't just his steady presence that anchored the chaos swirling in her mind. It was something deeper, something she couldn't quite explain. The way he handled the situation, unfazed, almost too calm, was unsettling. Most people would be in a state of panic by now, but not him. Marco stood there like he had been in this exact situation 100 times before, as though getting stuck in an elevator in the middle of a skyscraper was just another Tuesday for him. Her gaze wandered back to him as he continued to assess the emergency control panel. His fingers were sure and precise, moving from button to button with a kind of quiet expertise. He wasn't rushing, wasn't panicking, and certainly wasn't the slightest bit flustered. In fact, there was something almost serene about the way he handled it all. It was like he had all the time in the world, as if he knew exactly what was going to happen next. Nina tried to steady her breathing, her mind still racing with thoughts of the meeting and the uncertain future of Skin Stories. She couldn't afford to lose this opportunity, but now she was trapped in an elevator with a stranger, and she wasn't sure how long she could stay calm. She wanted to be angry. She wanted to scream at him about how messed up this whole situation was, how her life seemed to be falling apart one mistake at a time. But Marco, he didn't make her feel frantic. For some reason, being stuck in this elevator with him, despite everything going wrong, made her feel strangely anchored. She couldn't explain it. She could barely even identify it. But there was something about his presence, his quiet confidence, that made her feel like maybe, just maybe, everything wasn't as hopeless as it seemed. She shifted uncomfortably, trying to avoid making eye contact with him. She didn't want to seem vulnerable, but it was hard not to when she felt like she was standing on the edge of a cliff. She cleared her throat, trying to break the silence that had settled between them. "So," she began, her voice betraying a hint of nervousness, despite her best efforts to sound calm. "How long do you think we'll be stuck here?" Marco glanced up, his amber eyes meeting hers briefly before he returned his gaze to the control panel. "Hard to say. I've been in situations like this before. Could be minutes, could be hours. It all depends on how quickly they respond." His voice was smooth, matter-of-fact, like this was nothing more than an inconvenience in his day. It was both frustrating and oddly reassuring at the same time. Nina couldn't help but admire the way he remained so calm. It made her wonder, who was this man? Why was he so unaffected by something that would have most people on edge? "Seems like you're used to this," she said, a faint smile tugging at her lips, despite herself. Marco chuckled softly, though there was a strange weight to the sound. "You could say that. I've had my fair share of mishaps, but you learn to stay calm when you've dealt with enough of them." Nina raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Mishaps?" she repeated. "You seem like you've been through a lot." He shrugged, still focused on the panel in front of him. "You could say that. Life's a series of missteps, right? But it's not about avoiding the falls. It's about how you handle them." His words hit Nina harder than she expected. She was no stranger to missteps. Her business, Skin Stories, had been on the brink of collapse for months now, and her personal life was a tangled mess. She had spent so much of her time just trying to keep things together, trying to fix things that were broken. But Marco's words reminded her of something. She had long forgotten, the idea that maybe it wasn't about avoiding the crashes. Maybe it was about how you picked yourself back up afterward. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She glanced at him, a little surprised by the strange connection forming between them. In that moment, despite the claustrophobic space and the mounting frustration, Nina felt a strange sense of calm. As if, for the first time in a while, someone else understood what it felt like to be on the edge, but still choosing to stay steady. The silence stretched between them again, but this time, it wasn't uncomfortable. It was almost like two people who didn't need to fill the space with words. Nina cleared her throat, determined to push past the strange feeling that had settled in her chest. "I'm sorry if I seem a bit tense," she said, forcing a smile. "It's just that this meeting is everything for me. If I miss it, it could be the end for my business." Marco nodded, his gaze softening. "I understand. That kind of pressure isn't easy to carry." She felt a rush of gratitude for his understanding. It wasn't often that she found someone who actually listened, who didn't just brush off her stress with empty reassurances. "It's not just the business, you." "No," Nina continued, her voice quiet, more vulnerable than she intended. "It's everything. I've worked so hard for this. I can't lose it." Marco's eyes softened as he took a step closer. "I get it," he said quietly. "You're putting your heart into something, and it's hard to watch it fall apart. But sometimes, things fall apart so they can come back together stronger. I've seen that happen before." His words were simple, but they held a weight that Nina couldn't ignore. She looked down at her feet for a moment, gathering her thoughts. It was hard to open up to someone she didn't even know, but something about Marco made it easier. Maybe it was his calm, his steady presence, or maybe it was just the fact that she needed someone to understand. "I started Skin Stories because I needed something to anchor me," Nina confessed, her voice soft as she spoke. "Tattooing was always my escape, my way of creating something permanent when everything else felt so uncertain. But it's been tough. Every day feels like a fight, just to keep it going. And now I'm here, fighting for my business, fighting for something I've built from scratch. It's exhausting. Marco listened quietly, his gaze never leaving her as she spoke. His eyes were focused, intense, like he was taking in every word, every feeling she expressed. "Sounds like you've been carrying a lot," he said when she finished, his voice deep with understanding. Nina nodded, her shoulders heavy with the weight of it all. "I have, and I've been doing it alone for so long. Sometimes I don't even know if I can keep going." Marco stepped closer, close enough that she could feel his presence without him even touching her. "You don't have to do it alone," he said softly, his voice filled with something that felt almost like sympathy? Maybe. She wasn't sure. But there was an honesty in his words that made her heart flutter in a way she hadn't expected. "I don't know if I can trust anyone right now," Nina admitted, her voice a little shaky. "Not with this." "I understand," he replied quietly. "But sometimes trust isn't about sharing everything at once. It's about finding someone who's willing to help, even if you don't have all the answers." The elevator gave a sudden jarring lurch, bringing Nina back to the present. She gasped, instinctively grabbing the railing to steady herself. The panic that had been building in her chest was suddenly overwhelming again. But Marco didn't flinch. He was still, calm, still steady. He reached out, his hand steadying her without hesitation. It was a small gesture, but in that moment, it made her feel safe in a way she couldn't explain. She looked at him, her breath coming faster now. "You're not afraid, are you?" she asked, her voice tight. Marco smiled faintly, his amber eyes glinting with something unreadable. "No? Afraid of a broken elevator? Not really." She couldn't help but laugh, the sound echoing in the small space. It felt good to laugh, even if just for a moment. "I'm not sure how you do it," she admitted. "How do you stay so calm?" He shrugged, a little smile playing at the corners of his lips. "I've learned that losing my head doesn't help. Staying grounded, staying calm, helps me figure out what to do next." Nina studied him for a moment. There was something in his words, something in his presence that made her feel like maybe, just maybe, she could do the same. Stuck in the elevator, confronting new emotions. The elevator had stopped with a sudden jolt, leaving Nina disoriented for a moment. The flickering lights were the first sign that something was seriously wrong. Her heart skipped a beat as she pulled out her phone, hoping for a signal, any kind of connection to the outside world. But her screen flashed the dreaded "no service" message. She let out an exasperated sigh, gripping the phone tighter as if her frustration alone could will the signal back. She looked up at the control panel, then back at Marco, who had already moved to assess the situation with the same unnervingly calm demeanor he had shown before. Her hands were shaking now, her breath coming quicker as the full weight of the situation settled in. The meeting was slipping away, and there was nothing she could do to fix it. Her voice cracked as she turned to Marco. "I can't believe this. This is exactly the kind of day I didn't need. I'm stuck in an elevator, and my business is hanging by a thread. I'm supposed to be somewhere, and now everything's falling apart." Marco didn't look at her right. Away. He kept his gaze focused on the control panel, but Nina could feel the tension building between them. She was still pacing, her mind spinning, her heart pounding. She wanted to scream. She wanted to shout at him to fix this, to do something, anything. But there was no signal, no way out, and no way to change her circumstances. Nina's frustration bubbled over. "Why does everything have to go wrong today? I can't even believe this is happening. I'm late, I have no way of contacting anyone, and now my tattoo studio could go under because of this." She felt her voice rising, the panic inching its way up her throat. Marco finally turned to her, his amber eyes calm and steady. There was no anger in his gaze, no irritation at her outburst. Instead, his expression was soft, understanding, and almost too composed. "Take a deep breath, Nina," he said in his low, steady voice. "Panicking isn't going to help you. We need to stay calm. This will get sorted out eventually. You have to give it time." Nina's chest tightened. How could he be so calm? How could he stand there like nothing mattered? Her world was crumbling in front of her eyes, and he was acting like it was just another ordinary day. But as she looked at him, standing there so composed and relaxed, a strange thing happened. Her breath, which had been shallow and erratic, slowed. His presence, his calmness, seemed to have a strange effect on her. She hadn't realized how tightly wound she was until now. But with him, there was a kind of reassurance that settled deep inside her. "Time?" she repeated, her voice quieter now, more subdued. "I don't have time. This is the meeting that could make or break everything for Skin Stories. My clients, the investors, it's all on the line. I can't afford to sit here waiting. For eventually." Marco gave a small nod, his eyes still on her but softened with empathy. "I get it. I understand what you're feeling. But sometimes, the hardest thing to do is to let go. Take a step back. You can't control everything, Nina. And right now, the only thing you can control is how you respond to the situation. This isn't the end. It's just a setback. It doesn't define your success." Her thoughts were in turmoil. Nina wanted to argue, to tell him that he couldn't possibly understand the pressure she was under. But something in the way he spoke, something in the calm confidence that radiated from him, made her pause. It wasn't that she felt better. Not exactly. But it was like a small part of her was starting to listen. To him. To the idea that maybe, just maybe, this wasn't the end of everything. Marco took a slow, steady breath. "Tell me about Skin Stories," he said, his voice light but sincere. "What is it that you love about it?" Nina blinked, momentarily thrown off guard by his question. "What do I love about it?" she repeated, almost disbelieving. Marco nodded. "Yeah, I think understanding why you're doing something helps put things into perspective. So tell me why Skin Stories matters to you." For a moment, she couldn't speak. It was as if his question had unlocked something she hadn't thought about in a long time. She had spent so much time fighting to keep her business afloat that she hadn't taken a moment to appreciate why it all mattered in the first place. Slowly, her words began to flow, quieter now, more thoughtful. "I started Skin Stories because I needed something that would ground me, something that would make me feel like I was in control of my life. I used to feel lost, disconnected. I found that when I tattooed someone, I was creating something permanent, something real, something that could outlast the chaos of the world around me. I wanted to give people more than just tattoos. I wanted to give them art that meant something to them." She swallowed, trying to shake off the lump in her throat. The admission had come out of nowhere, and for a moment she felt exposed. But Marco was listening, really listening. His gaze intense, his body relaxed as he leaned slightly forward, his attention fully on her. "I've had my own share of struggles, Nina," he said softly. "I get what it's like to feel like everything is on the line, to feel like you're holding the weight of the world on your shoulders. And I know how it feels when everything seems to be slipping away. But it's how we handle those moments that counts. You're not alone in this." Nina met his gaze, feeling something shift within her. Was it hope? Relief? Maybe a little bit of both. She had never expected to find this level of understanding in someone she had just met. But the words were there, and so was his unwavering calm. I don't know if I can keep doing this, she confessed, her voice quieter now. Every day it feels like I'm just trying to hold everything together. But it's getting harder. The bills, the stress, the constant worry. I'm just so tired. Marco didn't interrupt. He just nodded, his eyes full of quiet understanding. It was like he was sharing a space with her, holding that weight without any judgment, without trying to fix it. For the first time in a long while, Nina felt like she wasn't carrying the burden alone. There was a long pause between them, the silence comfortable, though heavy with the tension of their situation. The elevator was still stuck, the seconds, stretching into minutes that felt like hours. But Nina didn't feel quite so trapped. Not by the elevator, not by her fears, not with Marco there, offering her something she hadn't known she needed. Space. The chance to just be for a moment, without the weight of the world pressing down on her. She couldn't explain it. But the longer they were stuck together, the more she realized how different he was from anyone she had ever met. Marco wasn't just calm. He had a quiet strength that made her feel like everything would be okay, no matter how out of control everything else felt. As the minutes passed, she felt herself gradually letting go of the anger, the frustration. Instead of feeling helpless, she began to feel something else, something like a spark of possibility. Could she really keep fighting for skin stories? Could she push past the fear that had paralyzed her for so long? She turned to Marco, her voice soft but steady. I'm sorry for snapping earlier. This whole thing has just been a lot. And I'm not used to feeling so vulnerable. But I guess I needed to hear that. He smiled then, a small, genuine smile that made Nina feel a warmth spread through her chest. It's okay. We all need someone to remind us that it's going to be all right. Sometimes we just have to take a breath and trust that things will work out. Nina nodded, the weight in her chest lightening a little. Maybe he was right. Maybe it wasn't about having everything figured out. Maybe it was just about taking things one step at a time. And just like that, despite the chaos surrounding them, she felt a glimmer of hope that she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time. Maybe this elevator ride wasn't just a setback. Maybe it was the start of something new. The conversation deepens. Unexpected connections. The hum of the emergency lights echoed in the small elevator, and the silence between them was heavy, yet strangely comfortable. Nina sat down on the edge of the metal floor, her arms wrapped tightly around her portfolio case. The weight of it, which had seemed so important just moments before, now felt insignificant in the face of the moment they were sharing. She glanced at Marco, who was standing across from her, leaning against the wall with his arms casually folded. There was something about his calm demeanor that made her feel more grounded, more centered. Despite the situation, despite the fear and frustration she had been battling, there was something about being stuck in this small, confined space with him that felt strangely peaceful. Nina took a deep breath, trying to shake off the mounting sense of helplessness that had taken over her. She needed to focus, to keep her mind from spiraling. And then, with a small sigh, she spoke up again, this time with a softer, almost reluctant tone. I guess I haven't really told you much about why I'm in such a hurry. I mean, I've been so wrapped up in the stress of it all. I never really stopped to explain why this meeting is such a big deal. She began, her voice quieter than before. Marco gave a small nod, his amber eyes never leaving her face, attentive and focused. It was as though he was listening, not just to her words, but to the unspoken weight behind them. Nina shifted slightly, adjusting her position so she was facing him more directly. I own a tattoo studio, Skin Stories. It's been my life for years now. But it's struggling. I'm meeting with an investor today, someone who could make or break the future of my shop. If I can land this contract, I can expand, hire more artists, and maybe even open a second location. But if this meeting doesn't go well... She trailed off, unable to finish the thought. Her fingers tightened around her portfolio, the pressure causing a slight tremor in her hand. Marco, without missing a beat, gave a small smile. It wasn't a mocking smile, but one that conveyed empathy, understanding. It sounds like a big deal, a life-changing kind of deal. His voice was steady, as if the gravity of her situation had settled with him as well. But there was no sympathy in his tone, just an honest acknowledgement of the stakes she was facing. Nina took a moment to absorb his words. She hadn't expected such a straightforward response. It felt different, more real, than the usual empty platitudes people offered in response to her stress. She had always been used to handling everything on her own, but something about Marco's straightforwardness made her feel like maybe it was okay to admit how much she had been struggling. "Well, you know how it is," Nina continued, her voice a little more controlled now. "Starting something from scratch, pouring everything you have into it. At first, it's all passion and excitement, but over time it becomes more about survival. You work yourself to the bone, day after day, and at some point you start wondering if it's all worth it." Marco watched her closely, his gaze soft but intense. "I understand," he said simply. "I've been there. It's easy to get lost in the grind, in the struggle. Sometimes you can't even remember why you started doing something in the first place." His words held an unexpected weight, a vulnerability that Nina wasn't used to seeing in a stranger, especially a stranger like him. Nina felt a sudden shift. The connection between them deepened, even though she hadn't intended for it to. She found herself wanting to know more about him, about why he could understand what she was going through so easily. "What about you, Marco?" she asked, surprising herself with the curiosity in her voice. "What's your story? Why are you in this building? What do you do?" There was a brief silence, and Nina felt a small flutter of unease. She had asked a question that felt too personal, too intrusive. But Marco didn't seem bothered by it. Instead, he looked at her thoughtfully, considering her question. "Well, I'm in the business of fixing things," Marco said, his tone light, but with a trace of something more serious behind it. He paused for a moment, as if searching for the right words. "HVAC systems, mostly. I work as a contractor for buildings like this, maintaining and repairing the mechanical systems that keep everything running smoothly. It's not glamorous, but it pays the bills." Nina raised an eyebrow, her curiosity piqued. She had expected him to say something like construction or engineering, but HVAC? It didn't quite match his appearance. His attire, well-fitted jeans, a dark Henley shirt, and steel-toed boots, seemed too stylish, too put together for someone in his line of work. Most mechanics she knew were more rough around the edges, but Marco didn't quite fit that stereotype. She couldn't help herself. "HVAC, huh? You don't look like the type who works with pipes and air ducts," Nina said with a small laugh, her voice warmer than it had been a moment ago. Marco smiled, a small but genuine smirk that made his amber eyes glimmer. "Yeah, I get that a lot. People always seem surprised when they find out. But you're right. It's not exactly a glamorous job. I don't usually talk about it much. It's not the kind of thing people want to hear about, you know?" He paused for a moment, as if deciding whether to say more. "But I've always liked fixing things. It's what I'm good at. Machines, systems. They make sense to me. I like the challenge of figuring out what's broken and making it work again." Nina studied him for a moment, sensing there was more to his story than he was letting on. There was something about him, a quiet intensity, a mystery that she couldn't quite place. But for now, she let the conversation stay light, letting herself bask in the odd comfort of his presence. There was something reassuring about the way he spoke, something that made her feel like everything would be okay, even if just for a moment. "Well, that's kind of incredible," she said, the words coming out more sincerely than she expected. "Not everyone has the patience for that kind of work. You really have to be detail-oriented to get it right." Marco nodded, his gaze drifting briefly to the elevator control panel, as if checking to see if anything had changed. "Yeah, I suppose. It's a lot like art, in a way. You have to understand how everything fits together, how all the little parts contribute to the bigger picture. And when it all comes together, it's like you've created something that works." The comparison hit Nina harder than she had anticipated. She had never thought of her work that way. But as Marco spoke, she realized he was right. Tattooing was art, but it was also about connecting the pieces, taking the individual elements, the designs, the emotions, and combining them into something permanent. Maybe their work wasn't all that different after all. There was a brief pause between them, a silence filled with mutual understanding, and yet something else was there too, something she couldn't quite name. The air between them felt charged, thick with the weight of their shared experiences, their vulnerabilities. Nina couldn't help but ask the question that had been nagging at the back of her mind. "So, you never really explained why you're here, though? Why this building? Why today, of all days? Are you just fixing the HVAC, or is there something more going on?" Marco's eyes flickered for a moment, the slightest shift in his expression that Nina barely noticed. But it was enough to make her wonder. He didn't answer right away, his gaze dropping to the floor, as if he was weighing his words carefully. I don't usually talk about it," he said slowly, his voice lower now, almost guarded. "But yeah, today's a bit of a strange day. I was called in to fix a specific issue, but there's more to it than that." He met her gaze again, but his eyes seemed distant now, like he was remembering something he didn't want to. Nina felt a wave of curiosity flood through her. She wanted to press him, to ask him why he seemed so cryptic, but she stopped herself. Maybe he wasn't ready to share everything yet. Maybe, like her, there were parts of his story he wasn't prepared to reveal. Instead of pushing, she leaned back against the elevator wall, giving him the space to say more if he wanted to. "Well, I get it," she said lightly, her voice softer now, more relaxed. "Sometimes we all have things we need to keep to ourselves." Marco gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, his eyes meeting hers with a flicker of appreciation. "Yeah, maybe some things are better left unsaid. For now." For a moment, there was nothing but the quiet hum of the emergency lights, the stillness between them stretching comfortably. Nina realized that despite the tension, despite the frustration of being trapped in this elevator, there was something she had not expected to find today. A connection. Something real. Something unspoken that had taken root between them in these few minutes of shared vulnerability. As the seconds ticked by, Nina found herself wondering what would happen when the elevator finally started moving again. What would become of the odd, unexpected bond that had started to form? She didn't know yet, but for the first time in a long time, she felt a flicker of hope. Maybe things weren't as lost as they seemed. Maybe she had more control over her life than she had given herself credit for, and maybe, just maybe, this unexpected encounter in an elevator wasn't as much of an accident as it seemed. The rising tension, the calm before the storm, the soft hum of the emergency lighting filled the silence between Nina and Marco, both still confined to the small, dimly lit elevator. Nina's thoughts raced, her mind weighed down by the constant worry about her tattoo shop. She had worked so hard to build it up, and now it all felt like it might crumble in an instant. Her hands trembled slightly as she glanced at the glowing numbers on the control panel, the floor count stuck between 30 and 31. She let out a long, frustrated breath. Marco's calmness was starting to feel like a foreign, almost, unsettling contrast to her inner turmoil. He had been so composed since the elevator had malfunctioned, his demeanor unwavering, like he had faced situations far worse than this, and had no intention of letting this minor inconvenience shake him. His presence, his tranquility, made Nina feel even more out of control. He seemed almost too perfect, too easygoing for someone who worked in a building full of high-powered executives and HVAC systems. The silence between them stretched on until the intercom crackled to life, and a voice from the security team broke through the quiet. "Hello, this is security. We've received your distress signal. Please remain calm. The repair team is on the way, but due to the nature of the problem, we estimate it will take at least 2 hours for full resolution. We apologize for the inconvenience." Nina closed her eyes for a moment, her body sinking deeper into the corner of the elevator. 2 hours. She could feel the weight of it settle on her chest. 2 hours meant that she would miss the most important meeting of her career, her shot at getting an investor, at saving her business. It was slipping through her fingers, and there was nothing she could do. She muttered something under her breath, a sharp, frustrated sound, as she pulled her phone out again. The no service message remained at the top of her screen, mocking her with its stubborn refusal to connect. Marco, still leaning against the opposite wall, watched her with quiet observance. She could feel his eyes on her, and it made her uneasy. He didn't look panicked, or even remotely stressed. It was almost as if the whole situation didn't faze him at all. As Nina continued to stew in her worries, he finally spoke, his voice low, calm, and strangely soothing. "Hey, take a breath," Marco said gently, his gaze flickering toward her. "Panicking won't help. Trust me, I know." Nina shot him a look, startled by the unexpected kindness in his voice. Her first instinct was to snap at him, tell him he didn't know what she was going through. But when she saw the steady calmness in his amber eyes, she hesitated. Maybe, just maybe, he was right. She couldn't keep spiraling like this. It wasn't helping, and it wasn't going to fix anything. With a heavy sigh, Nina leaned back against the elevator wall, trying to do what Marco had suggested. She closed her eyes for a moment, took a long, deep breath, and let it out slowly. A few moments passed before she opened her eyes again, glancing over at him. "I'm sorry," she muttered. "It's just... everything's riding on this meeting." "You know?" Marco nodded, his expression softening slightly. "I get it. When everything is on the line, it's easy to feel like the world is falling apart." Nina bit her lip, nodding in agreement. She didn't know why she was telling him this. This wasn't a conversation she would typically have with a stranger. But something about the way he carried himself, the way he spoke, made her feel like it was okay to unload a little bit. "So, you're in HVAC?" she asked, trying to shift the conversation away from her mounting anxiety. "That's unexpected, given your attire." She gestured to his fitted Henley shirt and dark jeans, which seemed far more suited to a night out than a job in maintenance. Marco chuckled softly, an easy, disarming sound that made Nina feel like maybe, just maybe, things weren't as bleak as they seemed. "Yeah, I get that a lot," Marco replied, leaning back slightly as he relaxed. "I'm more of a fixer than your typical technician. I don't exactly fit the usual mold, but the work is honest." He paused, and Nina could tell there was more behind his words. "And it's satisfying. Making things work again, you know?" Nina tilted her head, considering him for a moment. "So, you're good with your hands?" she asked, trying to keep things light. "Very good," Marco replied, the edge of a smile playing at the corner of his lips. Nina couldn't help but smile in return, even if only for a second. It was a rare thing, a genuine smile that came so easily in the midst of her stress. She found herself leaning back against the wall, her legs crossed, still holding her portfolio case in front of her like some kind of shield. The proximity of their shared space, the calm that Marco projected, was starting to work on her. Despite the tension, despite her worry, she felt the tiniest inkling of comfort. But that was when it happened. A subtle shift in the air. Marco's foot brushed against hers, just a light, accidental touch. The effect on Nina was immediate. She could feel the temperature of the small space rise, a slight tension between them that hadn't been there before. Her breath caught in her throat for a moment, her heart skipping a beat as she quickly shifted her foot back, hoping he hadn't noticed. But Marco had, of course. His eyes flickered to hers, a brief moment of understanding passing between them. A silent acknowledgement of the closeness, the shared space, the momentary contact that felt more significant than it should have. But Marco didn't pull away. He simply allowed the moment to linger, his posture still calm, still relaxed, but his gaze just a touch more intense. "Sorry about that," Marco said softly, breaking the silence that had followed. His voice was casual, but there was an underlying warmth in it, a softness that had not been there before. "Didn't mean to crowd you." Nina cleared her throat, trying to gather herself. She didn't want to dwell on it, but the moment had shaken her, in a way she couldn't explain. "It's fine," she said quickly, waving it off. I'm just a little on edge, you know?" "I get it," Marco said again, his voice steady. "We're in a tight spot, and you've got a lot riding on this meeting. I won't pretend I understand how you feel, but I do know what it's like to be in a situation where everything feels like it's slipping away. It sucks." Nina blinked, taken aback by his honesty. There was something raw, something real in the way he spoke. It felt like he wasn't just giving her empty words, but genuinely sharing something with her, something he understood deeply. The elevator lurched again, a faint movement that caused Nina to brace herself, but it soon stabilized. She felt her nerves fluttering, the anxiety creeping back in. I don't know what I'm going to do if this doesn't work out," Nina confessed, her voice barely above a whisper. "My shop is everything to me. It's my dream. And now, it feels like I'm just watching it slip away." Marco was silent for a moment, and then, without warning, he took a small step closer. Not much, but enough for Nina to feel the shift in the air between them. "Look, I know it's hard," Marco said quietly. "But if you're as good at what you do as I think you are, then you'll figure it out. And if not this meeting, then the next one. I don't know much about tattoos, but I can tell you're passionate about it. That counts for something." Nina met his gaze then, her heart pounding in her chest. He didn't understand the details of her work, but he understood the passion behind it, and that made all the difference in the world. "Well, thanks," Nina said softly, a little embarrassed by how vulnerable she had just allowed herself to be. She cleared her throat again, trying to regain some control over the conversation. "Anyway, I guess I should introduce myself properly. You know a little bit about me now, but I don't even know your full name." Marco's lips curled into a small, easy smile. "Fair enough," he said, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made Nina's breath catch again. "I'm Marco Leone, and you are—" "Nina Blackwood," she replied, her voice quiet but steady. She hesitated for a moment before adding, "I own Skin Stories. I've been tattooing for over a decade now." "Nice to meet you, Nina," Marco said, his voice sincere, his gaze never leaving hers. He paused for a moment, then added, "And for the record, I don't think you're giving yourself enough credit. You've worked hard to get to where you are. Don't let one setback define you." The words settled over Nina like a warm blanket, a simple, encouraging truth she hadn't realized she needed to hear. It wasn't much, but somehow it was everything. As they exchanged names, shared a little about their lives, the tension between them started to ease. The elevator, though still broken, didn't seem as claustrophobic as it had been before. They were trapped, yes, but for the first time since the malfunction, Nina felt like maybe, just maybe, she wasn't alone in it. And as the elevator stood still, neither of them could have predicted just how much more this seemingly random encounter would change their lives. Unexpected revelations. The first stirring of emotions. As the minutes stretched into what felt like hours, the initial anxiety Nina had felt began to shift, changing form into something altogether unexpected. She had expected to remain in a state of tension, confined by her mounting stress and the helplessness of being trapped in the elevator. But Marco, this calm, composed, and seemingly enigmatic man, was slowly eroding the edges of her frustration. His steady presence, his reassuring words, and the quiet understanding in his amber eyes had gradually thawed her initial coldness. Nina realized that she wasn't as uncomfortable as she thought she should be. The narrow space of the elevator, which had once felt oppressive, now felt oddly safe. She hadn't even realized how much she had been craving comfort and stability in her life until Marco came into the picture. He wasn't an ordinary stranger. He didn't seem like just another person she would encounter on a busy day. There was something magnetic about him, something she couldn't quite put her finger on, but something that drew her in, making her want to talk, want to be near him. And she hadn't expected that, not in the least. As they sat there in silence, Nina found herself sneaking glances at him. He wasn't just a maintenance man. He wasn't just a stranger she had met in a broken-down elevator. There was something different about him. She noticed how he had casually shifted his position, now leaning slightly forward with an air of quiet attentiveness, not quite invading her space, but undeniably present. His muscular build, evident even beneath the loose-fitting Henley, his sharp features, and those deep amber eyes. Everything about him spoke of strength, but also something deeper, something elusive. And it was in that moment, with the soft hum of the elevator and the steady warmth of his presence, that Nina felt it. This strange pull, this sudden, inexplicable attraction. It was as if her body had suddenly become acutely aware of his proximity, of the way he seemed so at ease while she was wrapped in a whirlwind of worries. His calmness was both infuriating and soothing, but most of all, it was compelling. "Are you always this calm?" Nina asked, breaking the silence. The question was out of her mouth before she had time to think about it, but she couldn't help it. She was genuinely curious. It was like he didn't even feel the tension in the air. Marco glanced at her, a flicker of surprise in his eyes, but then a knowing smile tugged at the corner of his lips. "Pretty much," he said casually. "It's kind of my thing. When you're used to fixing things that are falling apart, you learn to stay calm. Freaking out doesn't help anything." Nina laughed softly, the sound light and free despite the situation. "I guess I could use a bit of that. I'm not very good at staying calm." "I can tell," Marco replied, a teasing glint in his eyes, though his tone was still gentle. "You've been running on high-stress mode since I met you. You might want to give it a break sometime." His words, though light, made Nina pause. The acknowledgement of her stress, her always-on-the-go, always-on-edge nature, hit her harder than she expected. She had been so wrapped up in the hustle, in trying to make everything work, that she never stopped to breathe. She never allowed herself to just be. "You're right," she murmured. "I guess I haven't really let myself stop and just breathe in a while." Marco's gaze softened, and for the first time, he shifted his posture, moving just a little closer to her. There was no rush, no urgency in his movement, but it felt significant nonetheless. "You know, Nina," he began, his voice now quieter. "Life's not meant to be one endless run. It's okay to slow down sometimes. to let things happen instead of always trying to control them. Nina stared at him, surprised by the depth of his words. She had been used to people giving her advice about stress, about managing it, but no one had ever said anything like that to her. No one had ever really told her to let go. For a moment, their eyes locked. In the dim light of the elevator, it felt like time itself had slowed down, stretching between them, connecting them in a way that neither of them fully understood yet. "How do you know so much about letting go?" Nina asked, her voice softer now, touched with curiosity. Marco chuckled, a sound that held just the slightest hint of mystery. "Let's just say I've learned a few things over the years. Life doesn't always go the way you plan, but sometimes it's better that way." His words seemed to carry an unspoken weight, and Nina felt a strange compulsion to ask more. "What do you mean by that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, but filled with an earnestness she hadn't expected from herself. Marco hesitated for a beat, his eyes searching hers as if deciding whether or not to share more. Finally, he spoke, his tone quieter than before. "I don't always have everything figured out, but sometimes the best things come when you stop trying so hard, you just let them happen." Nina absorbed his words, feeling an unexpected pang in her chest. Something about the way he said it, with such raw honesty, made her want to trust him. It was strange, how quickly she felt like she could open up to him, even though they had just met. "You really think that?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "That it's all just supposed to happen?" Marco met her gaze again, his amber, eyes soft, full of a quiet understanding that made Nina's heart skip a beat. "Sometimes it does, but only if you let it." There was a heavy silence between them after that. Nina's mind raced, processing everything Marco had said. It was like he had unlocked a door inside her that she hadn't even known was there. He made it seem so simple, but Nina couldn't help but wonder. Was it really that easy? "Do you always talk like this?" she asked, trying to lighten the mood. But her voice carried an edge of seriousness. "Or is this just your way of dealing with elevators?" Marco laughed, the tension breaking between them once again. "You know, I actually do talk like this. I guess it's just how I am." Nina smiled, her heart feeling lighter than it had in hours. For the first time in a long while, she felt like she could just be with him, in this small, cramped elevator, in this strange situation. There was something comforting in that. But just as she was beginning to relax, the silence in the elevator was broken again, this time by Marco's words. "You know," he said, his voice thoughtful, "this probably isn't going to be the last time we run into each other." Nina raised an eyebrow, her curiosity piqued. "Why do you say that?" Marco shifted his weight, his eyes locking with hers in a way that sent a shiver down her spine. "Because I don't think our meeting was a coincidence. I don't believe in those kinds of things, not when it feels too right." Nina's breath caught in her throat. The air between them suddenly thickened, the words hanging in the space between them like an unspoken truth. She didn't understand it, but something about what he said struck a chord deep inside her. She had never been a believer in fate or destiny, but now, looking at Marco, feeling the strange pull toward him, she wasn't so sure. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice low, barely a breath. Marco seemed to study her for a moment as though weighing his words. "I think we were meant to meet, somehow. Maybe it's not the right time to talk about it, but I have a feeling our paths were always going to cross." Nina felt a chill run down her spine. She didn't know why, but the way Marco said it, so calm and sure of himself, made her believe him. She couldn't explain it, but deep down, she knew there was something more between them, something beyond this elevator ride. Before she could respond, the intercom crackled again, and a voice from the security team informed them that the repair crew had arrived and that they would be free in minutes. Nina let out a relieved sigh, but as the doors slowly began to open, she couldn't shake the feeling that what Marco had said wasn't just idle chatter. Their meeting, it had been too real, too intense. And just like that, with the doors opening and the world rushing back in, Nina realized that whatever had started between them, it wasn't over. It was only just beginning. Rising tension. Nina begins to feel the change. The elevator, once a minor inconvenience, had transformed into something far more unsettling. Time had stretched far beyond the expected. What had started as a slight inconvenience, a brief detour in her busy day, was now turning into something that tested both Nina's patience and composure. The minutes ticked by in painful silence, each second seeming to drag on longer than the last. The faint hum of the emergency lights, the occasional flicker of the fluorescent bulbs above, and the mechanical whirring of the elevator's failing systems only amplified the sense of claustrophobia that was beginning to creep up on her. At first, she had only been anxious about her meeting, her business, her looming deadline. But now, after what felt like hours, a different kind of tension had settled between them. Marco, still sitting across from her with his calm, easy posture, didn't seem to share her growing concern. His stillness, his deliberate movements, and his unshakable composure felt alien to her. Nina had always prided herself on being in control, on keeping her emotions in check. But something about the situation, something about him, was slowly gnawing away at that control. She found herself glancing at him more often now, noticing how his presence seemed to fill the space between them. It wasn't just his calmness that intrigued her. It was the way he seemed to belong here, in this cramped elevator, as if nothing could shake him. As the minutes passed, Nina started to feel something odd happening within her. The tight knot of anxiety in her chest, the frantic mental racing of thoughts, began to settle into something else. She found herself aware of his every movement, every shift of his posture. His amber eyes, which had first seemed sharp and penetrating, now seemed warm, almost comforting. But it wasn't just his eyes. It was the subtle shift in the air around them. There was something different about the way he occupied the space. Something almost magnetic, as if his presence was drawing her in, as if her body was reacting to his proximity. She had always believed herself to be the level-headed one, the one who could hold it together no matter the situation. But now, she was starting to question that. Marco didn't seem to notice. Or maybe he did, and chose not to acknowledge it. Instead, he continued to focus on the task at hand, remaining calm, keeping his attention on the elevator's control panel, occasionally speaking to Nina in his quiet, reassuring manner. His voice was a constant, steady rhythm that seemed to help ground her, even as the world outside the elevator seemed to drift further and further from her reach. "Don't worry," Marco said at one point, glancing over at Nina. "It won't be long. You'll make it to your meeting." His voice was low, almost soothing, but there was something else in it, something she couldn't quite place. She could feel his gaze on her, even when he wasn't looking directly at her. It was as if he was aware of her in a way that made her uncomfortable and yet strangely comforted at the same time. Nina let out a soft sigh, trying to ignore the warmth that seemed to settle in her chest whenever he spoke. "I don't know if I can make it," she admitted. "This meeting is everything for my business. If I don't make it, I might lose everything I've worked for." Marco gave her a quiet, thoughtful look. "I understand that," he said, his voice softer now. "But sometimes things happen for a reason. You might not see it now, but maybe this is a sign you need to slow down for a moment. Think about what you really want." His words, so simple and yet profound, lingered in the space between them. Nina wanted to argue, to defend her frantic pace and her desperation to succeed, but something in Marco's steady gaze held her back. He wasn't saying anything revolutionary, but the way he said it felt like a revelation, like he knew something she didn't. And for a moment, it was as if he was trying to share that wisdom with her. And yet, despite the calm and the wisdom that seemed to radiate from him, something else about Marco felt unsettling. It wasn't just the way he remained unfazed by their circumstances. It was the way. He looked at her, intense and yet distant, like he was seeing something in her that she couldn't understand. Nina felt exposed under his gaze, as if he could read her every thought. Still, it wasn't just his gaze. She began to notice the way his body responded to their proximity. Whenever they shifted positions, whenever their hands brushed against each other, the air seemed to crackle. And it wasn't just her. Marco, too, seemed aware of their closeness. Every time their eyes met, she could see a flicker of something in his expression, something that betrayed the calm facade he worked so hard to maintain. Nina found herself turning away from him, unsure of what to make of the emotions that were beginning to stir inside her. She shouldn't be feeling this way. He was just a stranger, a man who had helped her in an emergency. That was all. But as the tension grew, so did her curiosity. She couldn't stop herself from wondering. Who was Marco really? What was it that he wasn't saying? Why did she feel so drawn to him despite the strange, unspoken connection between them? And then, in the midst of the growing unease, Marco's voice broke through her thoughts. "You're different, Nina," he said, his voice quiet but insistent. "I can feel it. You've got this energy about you. Something unique." Nina froze. She hadn't expected him to say that. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of the words. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. Marco shifted his gaze to the control panel again, his fingers hovering near the emergency buttons. "It's like..." He paused, as though choosing his words carefully. "Like there's something inside you, something that's been waiting. I can sense it, even now. There's something about you that's not like other people." Nina's breath caught in her throat. The words hit her harder than she'd anticipated. "What are you talking about?" she asked again, this time more urgently, her heart pounding in her chest. Marco met her gaze, his eyes darker than before, something unreadable in them. "You might not know it, but you're connected to something older, something deeper. Your bloodline, your heritage." Nina shook her head, trying to make sense of what he was saying. "What does that even mean?" Before Marco could respond, the elevator jolted slightly, and the lights flickered, casting an eerie shadow over their faces. The momentary panic only heightened the atmosphere, as though the very fabric of reality between them had shifted. Marco, however, remained calm, his fingers drumming lightly on the metal surface of the elevator's wall. "I can't explain it all yet," Marco said, his voice low and steady. "But trust me when I say that you're not just an ordinary person. Neither of us are. And I think your past, your family's history, might be the key to understanding what's happening." Nina felt her pulse quicken, her mind whirling with questions. "What does this have to do with me? Why are you telling me this?" Marco glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "Because I think you're the reason I'm here. I think there's a reason our paths crossed today." His voice softened, a sense of mystery hanging heavily in the air. "And I think you're starting to realize it too." Nina felt her world tilt slightly, the weight of his words pressing down on her chest. She didn't know what to believe anymore. What Marco was suggesting sounded impossible, unbelievable. And yet somehow, part of her knew that there was truth in his words. There had always been something about her, something in her art, something in her connection to wolves that she couldn't quite explain. Was he saying that it wasn't just a coincidence? Was he saying that their meeting wasn't random? Marco seemed to sense her rising confusion. He reached out, his hand gently brushing against her arm. "I know it's a lot to take in," he said quietly, his voice softer now. "But I promise, there's more to all of this. More than either of us fully understand." Nina looked at him, her breath caught in her throat. The connection between them was undeniable now. Something that had started as mere curiosity, a passing moment of intrigue, had transformed into something much deeper. Something she didn't know how to control. Something she wasn't sure she wanted to control. As the elevator slowly began its descent, and the emergency lights flickered above them once again, Nina's thoughts swirled. What had she just heard? Was Marco really telling her that she was connected to something beyond her understanding? Something from her past? Something hidden in her bloodline? She didn't know what to believe, but the pull of curiosity, of something deeper, and the undeniable connection to Marco, was growing stronger. Whatever was happening between them, whatever truth lay ahead, she couldn't stop herself from wanting to understand it. The story of Marco and the final revelation. The elevator ride, which had started as a simple inconvenience, had turned into something far more than either of them expected. The faint buzz of the emergency lights filled the otherwise silent space between Nina and Marco, creating a sense of unease that neither of them could shake. For a moment, it was as if time itself had slowed down, the world outside of the elevator seeming a distant memory. They were two strangers trapped together, their lives unknowingly intertwined, but as the seconds dragged on, something more profound began to settle between them. The unspoken connection, however strange and inexplicable, was undeniable. Marco had been unusually calm, his presence in the confined space almost overwhelming in its stillness. Every time their eyes met, there was an intensity there that Nina couldn't ignore. It was as if Marco wasn't just looking at her, but seeing something deeper, something beyond the surface. It unsettled her. It drew her in. And yet, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was something he wasn't telling her. His calm demeanor, the way he seemed to always be in control, made Nina feel like she was missing a piece of the puzzle. But what was he hiding? And why did she feel so connected? To him, despite everything? Marco broke the silence, his voice low and deliberate. "Nina, I've never told anyone this before," he began, his amber eyes meeting hers. "But I'm not like other people. I don't think I'm like you either." Nina frowned, confused. What did he mean? She swallowed hard, trying to make sense of his words. There had always been something different about Marco, something that had intrigued her. But now that he was openly alluding to something deeper, she wasn't sure how to process it. "What do you mean?" she asked carefully, her voice barely above a whisper. "What are you saying, Marco?" He looked away for a moment, his gaze drifting toward the elevator's control panel. But it wasn't the machinery he was looking at. His thoughts were far away, and Nina couldn't help but feel like he was weighing something important. Finally, he turned back to her, his expression serious, yet there was a strange softness in his eyes. "I don't know how to explain this in a way that makes sense," he said, a hint of frustration creeping into his tone. "But you need to understand, Nina. There's a part of me that's not human. Not entirely." The words hung between them, heavy with the weight of something Nina couldn't quite grasp. She opened her mouth to respond, but Marco raised a hand to stop her, as if sensing her growing confusion. "I'm not crazy, and I'm not just some weirdo making up a story, but I'm not like everyone else. I'm not like the people you know. I have abilities." Nina's heart skipped a beat. Abilities? What was he saying? Was he talking about some kind of supernatural power? The thought felt absurd. But there was something in Marco's voice, something raw, something earnest, that made her question everything she thought she knew. What kind of abilities? She asked, her voice barely a whisper now. Marco shifted uncomfortably, his gaze flickering toward the ceiling as though he were looking for the right words. I don't know if I can explain it properly, but I've never been able to just be normal. It's like there's another side of me, something inside that doesn't belong to the world I've been living in. It's part of me, and it always has been. Nina felt a chill run down her spine. She couldn't quite put her finger on it, but Marco's words made her feel as though the very air around them had thickened, as though reality itself were bending, becoming something unfamiliar. She felt as though she were standing on the edge of a cliff, peering into a world she hadn't known existed. I'm not just talking about some weird quirk, Marco continued, his voice growing softer. I'm talking about something deeper, something ancient. It's in my blood, and I can feel it, every day. It's always been a part of me, even before I fully understood what it was. Nina swallowed, her mind racing. Ancient blood? What did he mean? Her confusion deepened, but so did the pull between them. She found herself leaning forward, drawn to him despite herself. What does that mean for you? What does it mean for us? Marco's eyes flickered briefly, as if the question had caught him off guard. He hesitated for a moment before speaking again, his voice strained. It means that I can do things that most people can't. It means that I'm not bound by the same rules as everyone else. And it means that I can't keep pretending to be just like you. Because I'm not. I can't be. The tension in the elevator thickened as Nina processed his words. A strange sense of unease settled over her, but it was mixed with something else. Something more powerful, more compelling. She found herself looking at Marco in a way she hadn't before. The man who had once seemed just another stranger in her life now felt different. He felt like someone from a world beyond her own. You're saying you're different, Nina said slowly, trying to wrap her head around the implications of his confession. You're telling me you're not human? Marco's gaze softened, but there was a flicker of something she couldn't quite place in his eyes, something guarded. Not entirely. I don't think you'll understand. But I'm not exactly like everyone else. I never have been. And I can't change that. For a long moment, Nina said nothing. Her thoughts spun in circles, desperately trying to make sense of the words that Marco had just spoken. There was something so strange about all of this, and yet, as she looked at Marco, as she studied the way he sat so confidently before her, there was also something about him that felt right. Her heart began to race again, and this time, it wasn't just from the tension of the moment. It was something more, a realization that, despite the uncertainty, despite the confusion, she was beginning to believe him. There was a part of her that knew there was truth in what Marco was saying, but then, just as quickly as the tension had built, something else began to creep in, something Nina hadn't expected. A sense of dread. She couldn't explain why, but she had a feeling that Marco's confession wasn't just about him. It was about something much bigger, something that had the potential to change everything. Before she could voice her thoughts, the elevator jolted again, and the lights flickered. This time, Nina felt a wave of nausea sweep over her. The air felt colder now. The connection between them, which had felt almost magnetic moments before, suddenly felt dangerous. What's happening? Nina asked, her voice sharp as panic began to rise again. Why is everything changing? Marco's gaze was intense, his eyes darker than before. I told you, Nina, he said softly. We were never supposed to meet like this, but now that we have I think we're both in danger. The things I've told you, they're not just stories. They're the truth. Nina could feel her heart pounding in her chest. Danger. What kind of danger? And what did he mean by that? She felt the weight of his words sink in, a chill creeping up her spine, and as the lights flickered again, she knew that whatever was happening between them, whatever Marco was trying to tell her, it was only the beginning. The end of the ride was still far from view, and the twists and turns ahead were ones that would take both of them to places they hadn't dared to imagine. As the elevator began to descend once again, Nina's curiosity and fear mingled into a strange cocktail of emotion. One thing was certain. Nothing in her life would ever be the same again. The unresolved connection and the promise of what's next. The tension between Nina and Marco lingered in the elevator, thick and palpable, like the heavy air before a storm. The awkwardness, the curiosity, and something else. Something far, deeper, far more consuming, settled between them, and neither knew what to do with it. The truth that Marco had just revealed about his nature was too much to process in a confined space, too much to digest in the middle of a moment when everything, in Nina's world, was upside down. But it was a truth that wouldn't be silenced. It was a truth that had set something in motion, something neither of them could stop. And though they were still stuck in the small elevator, unable to escape the physical confines of the metal box, neither could deny that their connection had somehow transcended that space, a bond that was now too strong to ignore. Nina sat quietly, her thoughts swirling. The world outside felt like it didn't matter anymore. Her tattoo shop, the investors, the meeting she was supposed to have, even her career. None of it seemed to carry the weight it had before Marco spoke those words. There was a part of her that was terrified of what this all meant, of the unknowns, of what she had just learned about Marco and himself. Yet another part of her, perhaps the part that had always been drawn to the unknown, to the mysteries of life, couldn't help but be intrigued. How could she not be? Marco wasn't like anyone she had ever met before, and she could feel in her bones that there was so much more to him than he had told her. They were interrupted by the sudden jolt of the elevator. The soft hum of the lights flickered again, the faint glow casting an eerie blue light across their faces. Nina's heart skipped a beat, a twinge of unease flashing through her as she glanced at Marco. His gaze remained steady, though, unbothered by the abrupt stop, his calm demeanor almost unsettling. His quiet strength only made her more curious, more attuned to his every movement. "You said we were in danger," Nina said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "What does that mean? What kind of danger are we talking about?" Marco turned toward her, his amber eyes softening, though there was an unmistakable seriousness in them now. The kind of danger that you can't prepare for. The kind of danger that changes everything. He paused for a moment, as if weighing the consequences of what he was about to say. "I'm not the only one who knows about us, about you." Nina's heart began to race again. "What do you mean, about me?" He let out a breath, his gaze flicking to the elevator's control panel, then back to her. "I mean, Nina, you're not as ordinary as you think you are. There's something in your blood, something tied to the past, something ancient." His words hung in the air, thick with unspoken meaning. Nina shook her head, confusion overtaking her once more. "But I don't understand. I'm just a tattoo artist. My whole life has been about ink and skin, and now you're telling me that there's some ancient power inside of me?" Marco's lips tightened, and he nodded slowly, his voice barely audible as he spoke again. "You have abilities that you haven't even begun to understand. Your connection to wolves, to the art you create. It's not by accident. It's in your blood." Nina opened her mouth to protest, to deny it. But the weight of his words held her back. She felt a shiver run through her body. Not of fear, but of something else, a kind of recognition, like a part of her had always known this. But how could she possibly believe it? Just as she opened her mouth to ask more questions, the elevator jolted again, and this time, the lights flickered out entirely. A deep silence enveloped them, the world outside completely cut off. Her pulse quickened, her breath shallow. The sense of isolation grew heavier. But in the darkness, Marco reached for her hand, his touch warm and steady, and she felt herself instinctively grip it back. Despite everything that was happening, despite the unknowns and the confusion, she felt safer with him in that moment than she had before. "Trust me, Nina," Marco murmured, his voice low. "We're going to get through this. But you need to be ready. For everything." Nina didn't know what he meant, but she nodded, the uncertainty still there, but somehow muted by his presence. She trusted him in a way she couldn't explain. She had only known him for a short time, but the connection between them was undeniable. And then, just as the silence stretched between them, the elevator's emergency light flickered back on, its weak glow cutting through the darkness. Marco let go of her hand and turned his attention to the control panel, pressing the emergency call button. The elevator jerked back into motion, slowly, as the mechanical hum returned. The faint light illuminated his face, and for the first time, Nina noticed something she hadn't seen before. The slight tension in his jaw, the way his hand gripped the control panel like it was his only anchor in a world that had suddenly become unmoored. "Marco," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "What happens now? You said there were people who knew about me. What does that mean?" Before he could respond, the elevator lurched again, this time with more force. The lights flickered violently, then went out once more. Nina gasped, her heart pounding in her chest. "Marco!" she cried, panic rising once more. "I know," he said, his voice tight with urgency. "I'll explain everything. But we have to get out of here first. Stay with me, Nina." There was no more time for explanations, no more time for questions. The elevator, once again, came to a halt. This time, it felt final, as if the very foundation of their world had stopped turning. As they stood there, the silence settled around them, broken only by the low hum of the emergency light. Nina could feel the weight of everything she had learned, settling on her shoulders. She had come to this building that day with a goal, something that could have changed her life. But instead, she was facing an entirely different kind of change. A change she wasn't sure she was ready for. But Marco's steady presence was a balm in the chaos, his calmness grounding her in a way she hadn't expected. She found herself drawn to him in a way she couldn't quite explain. The bond between them was shifting, deepening, in ways that both scared and fascinated her. And just as she began to ask another question, something strange happened. The doors of the elevator creaked open slightly, enough for Nina to see a shadow standing just outside. The figure was tall, imposing, and it was impossible to make out the details in the dim light. Marco stiffened, his eyes narrowing. "Stay back," he said, his voice sharp. But before Nina could ask what was happening, the figure stepped forward into the light, revealing an unfamiliar face. A man with pale blue eyes, the same intense gaze Marco had. "I'm sorry to interrupt," the man said with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "But I think we need to talk." Marco's face hardened at the sight of the stranger. "What are you doing here?" he demanded, his voice low and dangerous. The man looked at Nina, his gaze sweeping over her with something like recognition, then back to Marco. "I was looking for you," he said calmly, "and I believe it's time we spoke about Nina and her bloodline." Nina's heart skipped a beat. "Bloodline?" Marco stepped forward, his body blocking her view of the man. "Not now," he said sharply. The stranger smirked, unfazed by Marco's protective stance. "Oh, but it's too late for that, my friend. The clock's ticking. And I think you both have more to lose than you realize." As the elevator door closed behind the stranger, Nina felt a wave of unease flood her. Whatever this was, whatever had just started between her and Marco, it was only the beginning. The door to their world, a world she had never imagined, was opening, and there was no turning back now. To be continued. Stay tuned for the next chapter of Nina and Marco's journey, where secrets will be uncovered and the stakes will rise. Ever found yourself trapped in a small space with a stranger who might just change everything? This is the story of Nina Blackwood and Marco Leone, two souls locked together in a moment that neither expected, but both will never forget. It all started with an elevator. But not just any elevator. This was in Archer Tower, where time seemed to freeze as Nina rushed in, late for the meeting that could save her business. Her heart raced as the doors closed behind her, only to reveal the last person she ever expected to meet. Marco Leone, man who looked more like a rock star than a mechanic, with amber eyes that seemed to see straight through her, a calm demeanor that made Nina's anxiety feel even more out of place. He wasn't worried, and somehow, that made her feel even more frantic. As the elevator ascended, the silence between them grew heavier. Nina's mind was elsewhere, on her tattoo shop, the investor she was about to meet, and the fact that everything felt like it was slipping through her fingers. But Marco? He wasn't in a rush. His eyes were on the elevator doors, his posture relaxed, like nothing could possibly shake him. Then, the unthinkable happened. The elevator lurched, then stopped. Just like that, they were stuck. The lights flickered out, plunging them into darkness, and for a moment, all Nina could hear was her heartbeat in her ears. Her first instinct was to panic. But Marco? He was calm, cool, and in control. His deep voice sliced through the tension. "It's all right," he said. "We'll get out soon enough." But for Nina, this was more than just a stalled elevator. It was a moment that would change everything. She could feel it in the air. A strange pull between them. As the minutes ticked by, Nina's frustration grew. Her meeting was slipping away, her business hanging by a thread. Her phone had no signal, and she was trapped in this tiny metal box with a man she barely knew, but who seemed to radiate an energy she couldn't ignore. Marco, sensing her unease, turned to her, his voice soft but steady. "Hey, take a breath. Panicking won't help." It was strange. His words, his calm. Something about him just calmed her. For the first time all day, Nina took a deep breath. "You're right," she muttered, adjusting her grip on her portfolio. It wasn't just the situation. It was something else, something about Marco. His presence was like a slow-burning fire. His amber eyes, though quiet, seemed to see something deeper in her than anyone ever had. They talked. And as the elevator stayed still, so did the world around them. Marco asked about her business, and she found herself telling him more than she had planned. "I own a tattoo studio," she confessed, her voice unexpectedly softer now. "It's called Skin Stories. I'm hoping this meeting will save it." Marco nodded thoughtfully. "That's cool. What kind of tattoos do you do?" "I specialize in custom work. Intricate pieces. My art is about telling stories on skin." Nina was surprised at how easily the words slipped out, as if Marco's calmness had unlocked something in her. Then, it was his turn. "I'm just a fixer," Marco said with a half-smile, his eyes twinkling. "HVAC systems. The system on the 35th floor was acting up." Nina chuckled despite herself. "I never would have guessed that from your look." Marco grinned. "Most people wouldn't. I like to keep things simple." His gaze softened then, a quiet understanding between them growing. But just as the air felt charged with something more, the elevator groaned again, the lights flickering as though mocking their conversation. Nina shifted nervously. "I'm already 20 minutes late," she said, her voice tight with frustration. "They're never going to reschedule. This is my last chance." Marco glanced at her, his expression serious. "You're stronger than that, Nina. I can tell." For the first time, Nina met his gaze fully. It wasn't pity. It wasn't even empathy. It was something more raw, more real. "I don't even know why I'm telling you all this," she admitted, her voice quieter now. "You've got a lot on your shoulders," Marco replied, his voice low and reassuring. "But you're not alone, not right now." And for some reason, those words stuck with Nina. There was something in Marco's gaze, something unspoken, but undeniably present. The intercom crackled to life, but it didn't bring the relief Nina was hoping for. "Repairs will take at least 2 hours," the voice said. Her heart sank. 2 hours? She repeated aloud. "This is a nightmare." For a moment, Marco just watched her, his expression still, unreadable. Then, he reached into his pocket, pulling out his phone, but he had no signal either. For the first time since they'd met, there was a brief flicker of tension on his face. "Guess we're stuck," he said simply. But in that moment of uncertainty, something shifted. Marco's eyes locked onto hers, and there was a quiet intensity in his gaze. Nina could feel it, a pulse, something that went beyond just the moment. "Looks like we'll have to make the best of it," Marco said, a wry smile tugging at his lips. Nina couldn't help but smile back despite herself. "I guess we do." Just then, the intercom crackled again. "We've found the problem, but it may take a few hours. Please remain calm." Nina slumped against the elevator wall, the weight of her situation sinking in. But Marco? He sat down against the opposite wall with an easy smile, as though this was just another day for him. "Let's just make ourselves comfortable," he said, almost teasingly. His ease was contagious, and for the first time, Nina felt herself actually relaxing. Her heart was still racing. Was it from the stress? Or was it because of Marco? Was there more between them than just two people stuck in an elevator? As time passed, their conversation drifted into more personal territory. They began to reveal pieces of themselves, little by little, and the connection between them deepened. But Nina couldn't shake the nagging feeling that Marco wasn't telling her everything. Something about him felt different. Was it just her imagination? Or was there more to Marco than met the eye? As the silence between them stretched, Nina couldn't help but wonder. What was really happening here? Was Marco just a guy stuck in an elevator? Or was he something much more? One thing was certain, this moment would change them both forever. But what will happen when they finally get out? Stay tuned. The story isn't over yet.